Hi and welcome to this Conflict and Tension 2020 GCSE paper. This is a walkthrough of the 2020 GCSE paper and give you some feedback on how to answer this paper. So the first question number one, says be source A. Source A is critical of the Munich Agreement. How do you know? Explain your answer using source A and your contextual knowledge. Now this question is worth 4 marks. So when you go into the exam, you need to be looking at this source really carefully. Look at the provenance of the source. So you can see here, this is a cartoon published in the USSR. So that's going to be really significant for you to think about. It's produced in 1938. It comments on the Munich Agreement, which is from September 1938, and the wolf is representing Nazi Germany. Now, the two key phrases there are the sign that says "Go East," and the country which is being fed into the mouth of the wolf is Czechoslovakia. So, how do we approach this question? Well, here's how. So it's really important that you do really focus on answering the question. So I would recommend that you quote the question in your answer. So you begin with a phrase such as, I know that source A is critical of the Munich Agreement. And then you can go on to really pick out some of the details on the source. Now you can pause this and read that example answer. But some of the key things that you need to think about in terms of how you would know that it's critical of the Munich Agreement is the fact that Britain and France are shown to be sacrificing Czechoslovakia. And sacrificing Czechoslovakia to a wolf, which implies that the intentions of Germany are not good, that Germany can't be trusted, and that the Munich Agreement has shown that Britain and France and the Allies are sacrificing Czechoslovakia. The phrase "go east" as well suggests that they are trying to encourage the wolf of Germany to go east, and there is obvious criticism of that, and you want to try and link that into the fact that this is a cartoon published within the Soviet Union by the USSR. Obviously the Soviet Union will feel vulnerable if Germany is moving towards the east, and we know from our own knowledge that Stalin was concerned about the threat of Germany, and that is where your own knowledge will come in. So in terms of your own knowledge, any own knowledge that you include for this question must be linked to the actual features of the source. So it must explain about the Munich Agreement. So some key knowledge here would be around the Sudetenland being sacrificed at the Munich Agreement. You could also talk about the fact that the Soviet Union wasn't invited or consulted on the Munich Agreement and how angry that made Stalin feel. And therefore, within this context, you can link to your own knowledge, but also to the provenance of the source in terms of it being produced and written within the Soviet Union, within the USSR. So there's an example answer there for you to have a look at. So here's what the mark scheme looks like for question 1. So a few top tips for this. It's only worth 4 marks, so try not to spend more than 6 minutes on the question, and just some key points there for feedback. Make sure you refer to the details on the source by quoting the source. Write about the provenance of the source. That's not absolutely essential, but where relevant, that's going to add to your response. And make sure that any own knowledge that you include is specifically linked to the source, and there is a requirement to use your own knowledge to help explain your answer. So question number 2 is the usefulness question. So you will be given 2 sources, B and C, and the question is about how useful are sources of B and C to an historian studying the remilitarisation of the Rhineland. And it's really important when you tackle this question that you make sure that you are explaining how these sources would be useful to an historian studying that specific inquiry. So how useful would the source be if a historian was studying the remilitarisation of the Rhineland? So the first thing you do with this question is you read through the sources really carefully, and you're looking at 2 aspects. So you're looking at what is the provenance of these sources, where it's come from, who wrote it, when it was written, for what reason, for what purpose it was written, but also the content of the source. So what does the source actually say? So you read the sources. What I would recommend is that you're underlining key points. You're thinking about how it might be useful, thinking about some key quotes that you can include in your answer. So straight away you can see one of the things that stands out from this source is that it is an extract from a letter from the German government to the British government. Similarly with source C, this is a cartoon, so you need to be thinking about what you can infer from the cartoon, and therefore what an historian could infer from the cartoon, but also recognise where it comes from. And in this case, it's really important to recognise this is a British cartoon. Of course, the fact it's a cartoon may well affect how useful it is, it may well exaggerate the point, but obviously it's still very, very useful, even if you might think the source is slightly biased, because it's going to give an historian a specific point of view. The portrayal of the goose, just understanding it gives you this information there. The goose step is a British term to describe the German army's marching style. And a few things there to be aware of. It's really important to pick out the details of the sources. So you can see that underneath the goose there is a ripped up piece of paper that says Locarno, so that's significant, and then a caption, peace, German style. So how do you answer this question? Well, what you need to do is you need to make sure that you're explaining how useful the content of the source would be, but also how useful the provenance of the source would be, and for each one link with own knowledge. Now, many students are very, very good at writing about the content of the source, but less so about provenance. And it's very important to realise that you can get a maximum of 9 marks out of 12 if you don't write about provenance. So in order to be able to get into level 4, 10 to 12 marks, you must write about provenance. So there's a few top tips there for you to read. One of the big things I would say is make sure you use the phrase useful throughout. So keep using the phrase, keep linking back to the question. Okay, why would this be useful? How would it help a historian? Would it be very useful, extremely useful, quite useful? So keep having a look at that. So let's have a look at an example answer. Now you can pause this video to read this example answer, but some of the key things to think about here is that you want to start off your answer by quoting the question in your answer. So use a phrase like, source B is very useful for an historian. And then you're going to focus on the content of the source. But all the time you want to be thinking about, right, what would this actually help a historian understand? And what's absolutely crucial for this question is that you avoid just describing the source. So you can see in the 5th line down, I've used the phrase, it also helps an historian to understand that Germany argued it was threatened by the French alliance with the Soviet Union and that it was, quote, ready to make new agreements to secure peace. So when you're writing about content, you need to really think about how useful it would be for a historian. You can also use your own knowledge in order to back up and say, well, actually, I know that this is true, and therefore it's going to make it more useful as well. Very important to write about provenance. So even if the source might be slightly biased, that's still going to make the source useful, because it's useful to understand, well, what kind of point of view were they trying to put across, for example. Okay, so that would be an example answer for source B. So some key feedback points there. Write about how useful the content and provenance are, linking it to how it fits in with your own knowledge. Link the content to your contextual knowledge. So phrases like this is backed up by my knowledge. Evaluate and analyse how useful the source is. So you need to think about what it would help an historian to understand. And I'll talk about the short conclusion in just a moment. So again, another example answer for source C. I'll let you pause that and read that, but just notice how it talks about both content and provenance. So here we have an example conclusion that you could write about. So you would say something like, taken together, both sources would be highly useful to understand the justification the German government made, but also to understand that some people in Britain were highly critical of this and felt it was in fact an aggressive act. Therefore, source B and source C can show opposite viewpoints, the motivations behind the remilitarisation of the Rhineland. Source B suggesting it was done, for peace. Source C suggesting this is more an aggressive military action. So in terms of key feedback points, the structure is a paragraph on source B, a paragraph on source C, a short conclusion showing how an historian can use both sources together. So you might say within this question something like, well, source B, its focus is on the German justification for the remilitarisation of the Rhineland, and source C is about how the British response to that was they were quite frustrated, or some people in Britain were quite frustrated that Britain didn't do anything. And that cartoon almost serves as a warning for British inaction over the remilitarisation of the Rhineland. And you might then make a quick comment about what is missing from this inquiry. So, for example, we haven't got the French perspective on the remilitarisation from these two sources together. You do not need to say which of the two sources is the most useful. It's about how useful the two sources are together, really, in terms of finding out about the remilitarisation of the Rhineland. So question 3, really going to test your own knowledge this one. This question, write an account of how events in Abyssinia affected the League of Nations. Really what you're looking for in this question is writing a chronological response, which very much focuses on the consequence of the event. It's really important to tie in the two aspects of the question. So on the one hand, you're looking at events in Abyssinia, and then you're being able to explain, well, how do they affect the League of Nations? So here's an example answer, and obviously you can pause that and you can read that. But you notice in this answer you've got very specific own knowledge. You've got very specific dates in here. So you've got, for example, the border skirmish at Wau in December 1934. You've got, for example, the Stresser Front in April 1935. You've got the actual invasion in October 1935. You've got the Hall of Owl Pact. You've got Selassie's speech to the League of Nations. So you're very much showing how one event led to another. So in terms of key feedback points, show how the impact of different events and link to the tail of the question affected the League of Nations. That's the key thing to say, how did this affect the League of Nations? What was the consequence of Abyssinia on the power of the League of Nations? So some key phrases here: as a result of, this led to, as a consequence, and we really need that clear chronological understanding. So that focus on a clear beginning, a clear middle, and a clear end as well. So you can just pause that and have a look at that example answer. So a real test of your own knowledge, this one. And I think what it shows is that as part of your revision, you really need that emphasis on knowing when events happen, because if you don't know when the events happened and you aren't able to articulate the story of this event or another event, could be about something like the Manchuria crisis or about German rearmament or appeasement, then you're going to struggle to really show how one event led to another. And that's where the key analytical points come in. So question 4 is the 16-mark question. This is the same exam technique as you have on Elizabeth question 4. So this question, they will give you a stated factor. That's going to be your first factor to write about. And then you need 2 other factors plus a conclusion. So what's really, really key in this one is that you're really getting that analysis in there. So I would recommend that you only write about 3 factors. Even in this question, you could probably write about 5 or 6 different factors, but really do 3 factors well. And then what you've got to do is make sure that you've got that analysis in there. So when you're really looking at PEA structure, the point, evidence, and analysis is absolutely crucial. So we've looked at this structure before, and you have this triangle, and it's a really nice way to think about, you're going to look at 3 factors and the conclusion. So you start off with a stated factor. So in this case, it's reparations. So you know that's going to be the first paragraph. And then you need 2 other factors. So I'd probably go for military restrictions, and then I'd probably go for territorial changes. And then I know that my last paragraph is going to be the conclusion. So once you've got that structure in your head, then you know you're going to be writing 4 paragraphs for this answer. So what kind of things do you need to do? Well, this is what you need to do. You need to have key evidence from your revision. So that's really important, that key own knowledge. You need to have well-selected evidence, so killer facts. Just avoid description. So, you could have a paragraph about territorial changes and you could list every single bit of territory that Germany lost, but actually, how are you going to use that evidence? So really thinking about the importance of Alsace-Lorraine to France. Analysis, analyse the importance of the factor. And link factors together, compare their importance throughout the essay. Don't just leave that to the conclusion. So you use phrases like, this was a really important factor, this was a crucial factor because. And then judge in the conclusion which is the most important factor. Don't sit on the fence. Make sure you choose which is the most important factor. So there's some example paragraphs here which you can pause and have a look at. But really you're looking at that point, evidence, analysis structure. Just note within this example answer, example paragraph, you're looking at key phrases like, this was an important factor because. So you're starting to analyse, you're starting to think about the evidence that you've got. Again, another paragraph on military restrictions. Please pause that to have a read of it. Territorial reasons, again, key factors that you can get. And you're looking at your killer facts, Alsace-Lorraine, North Schleswig to Denmark, etc. And then you go for a conclusion. Now, what I would say with a conclusion, look at those key yellow points there. Recognise the alternative viewpoint and then knock it down. And then state what you think is the most important factor. Highlight what's your killer fact. So for me, I would go territory, and I would say Alsace-Lorraine to France. That is huge. That is probably the most important territorial change. And then lastly, what I'd like you to think about is what's the most important factor overall. So you clearly explain that. Okay, and thanks for listening. And just a reminder about our academic writing sheet, just to help you write academically in your work as well. Thanks for listening, and bye-bye.